Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Chester Arthur, and the focus is shocker, from spoilsman to reform champion. The year is 1882. Congress is back in session, passing legislation, sending it off to Chester Arthur in the White House. This is not the kind of work that Arthur liked to do, but he was also not going to be simply a rubber stamp for the Congress. He was taking his responsibilities seriously. So let's start with an issue out west, where there had been a backlash over Chinese immigrants. Now, for a long time, these immigrants had been welcome. They were a source of inexpensive labor to build out the railroads out west. This was a good thing. But over time, many of these immigrants, if not most, did not assimilate much into the Western culture of the United States. And importantly, those low wages they were willing to work for, that was starting to really depress the salaries of everybody else across the entire region. So there was this push from the West for Congress to pass some sort of exclusion to stop immigration coming in from China. Now, Congress had actually passed a bill to this effect a few years before, but President Rutherford Hayes had vetoed it. Hayes vetoed it in part or primarily because there was a treaty in place between the United States and China at the time, and he thought this act would actually violate that treaty. But that treaty had recently been renegotiated. So Congress brought the Exclusion Act back, they passed it, sent it to Chester Arthur, and Arthur vetoed it as well. Now, many cheered Arthur over this, again, going up against this supposedly xenophobic legislation, but not so fast. This was not really a principled veto on the part of Arthur. It was really just about the duration. Arthur basically told Congress 20 years is too long. You want to exclude Chinese immigrants? Do it for less than that, and I'll sign it. That's what they did. They repassed the law. It was at 10 years instead of 20, and Chester Arthur signed the Chinese Exclusion Act into law. Another for his consideration was the annual River and Harbor Bill. Now, Arthur was a former Whig who had favored federally funded internal improvements, but over the years, this annual River and Harbor Bill had gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, and frankly, Chester Arthur said enough's enough. There were 300 items on the bill this year, $19 million, and Arthur said in his veto message, the extravagant expenditure of public money is an evil, not to be measured by the value of that money to the people who are taxed for it. In this case, didn't do any good. The bipartisan greed in Congress, they wanted those federal funds used in their local districts. They overrode his veto. Julia Sand, the woman in New York, who was writing him these letters, kind of the barometer for the Arthur administration, offered her praise to Chester Arthur in a letter. I am so proud of you, she wrote. I cannot put it in words. The rascals who have pushed their measure through in spite of you may fancy they have gained a victory over you, but in truth you have triumphed. She's always trying to prod him to do the right thing. Another headache for Arthur was the so-called Starroot Trials. Now, this was a case of corruption being accused against some pretty senior people in the political world. The Starroot were these mail routes in the southwestern portion of the United States that were available for pretty low bid because the remote nature of the country kind of could get expensive to deliver the mail, and so there was a provision that allowed for the increasing in the cost of these routes once they were actually awarded. And that's exactly what happened. Almost immediately these were raised, the rates were raised significantly, and some people started crying foul. This was a rigged game for political insiders to buy low and then bid it up. And among the senior Republicans who were accused in this was Stephen Dorsey, a member of the Republican National Committee. There were others caught up in this as well. To Chester Arthur's credit, he played no favorites. He knew all these people and he knew them well, but he stayed out of it and he gave his Attorney General Benjamin Brewster, frankly, whatever support he needed. Brewster and his team went forward with 2 trials, each lasting more than 6 months. These were complicated cases. There were sort of 2 sides to every issue, and ultimately the results of the trials fell flat. Only 2 people were convicted. They were kind of minor players. The rest were either hung juries or not guilty verdicts, and the country was kind of disappointed. After all the corruption in Ulysses Grant's second term, this was sort of the next big wave of that. People sort of expected more from the prosecution. It didn't play well for the Chester Arthur administration that wasn't able to deliver it, but again, for Arthur, he gave his Attorney General complete complete support on these trials. He played no favorites. Now, there was another trial going on that was more successful. This was the murder trial of Charles Guiteau, the man who had shot James Garfield and assassinated him the previous year. Now, Guiteau had put forward an insanity defense. He also blamed Garfield's doctors for the death of Garfield, and there was some truth in that, as we covered in a previous episode, but this was all to no avail. The jury came back in less than an hour, and they found him guilty, and Charles Guiteau was sent to the gallows. He was hanged on June 30th, 1882, just a couple of days shy of the one-year anniversary of the assassination of James Garfield. Now, in August of 1882, Congress finally left town. This was great news for Chester Arthur because a lot of the work was off his desk. He could actually take a vacation. He went north, where he went fishing to clear his head. This was a good time for him. Of the few good times that he had as president were either in social situations or when he was on vacation. He also visited his home in New York City, and by now Julius Sand had been writing him pretty regularly, 15 letters to date. That combination of blunt criticism but also encouragement to be the best that he could be. But she wanted one more thing. She wanted the President of the United States to visit her at her home. She was an invalid. She was not physically able to go try to visit him at the White House, and she kept encouraging to come visit her. And in this case, Chester Arthur, on this trip, he came. He showed up at the Sand residence, and frankly, it did not go well. It was awkward and really stiff, and Sand kind of blamed her family, who wouldn't leave her and the President alone to have a more intimate conversation. But frankly, the whole thing didn't go well. Arthur stayed for about an hour. Neither didn't live up to either of their expectations. But Sand also noticed something else. She wrote in a follow-up letter to Arthur, he was not a well man in her mind. She wrote that your visit left a rather sad impression on me. It seemed to me that you were not well, that you were very heavy and worn out. Well, there was more to this story than even Julius Sand knew, because President Arthur was sick. He was struggling with bouts of nausea, indolence, some moodiness, and depression. He was concealing this from everyone. Look, the country had just gone through an assassination of his predecessor. The last thing he wanted was anybody to worry about his health, but something was clearly not right with the President of the United States. Well, while he was on his vacation, there was the first election in New York State that Chester Arthur sat out in a long time. The state elections were going on. This was the bailiwick of Chester Arthur for all these years. He had nothing to do with this one. He stayed out of it. His Treasury Secretary, Charles Folger, ran for the governorship up against the mayor of Buffalo, Grover Cleveland, and Folger was trounced. It was a strong victory for Cleveland. The Democrats actually were on the rise, not only in New York, but they were winning big in other states. This was not looking well on the Republican administration of Chester Arthur. Well, this was a critical moment for Arthur's presidency. Julius Sand and others were among those who continue to push Arthur on this topic of civil service reform. Again, thinking back to Charles Guiteau, that deranged office seeker that assassinated the previous president, this topic of civil service reform was even more pronounced because of that assassination. Sand wrote that if you believe that civil service reform is a real public need, then stand by your conviction openly and earnestly, and let your example be such that no man can question your sincerity. Do not waver. If a thing is worth doing, do it with your whole soul. Well, Arthur had actually been off to kind of a strong start on this topic. He had stood up to his boss, Roscoe Conklin. He had made no wholesale removals for political purposes. He was not going to be subservient to the New York political machine. And by the way, Roscoe Conklin noticed. He was turning his biting sarcasm on his former lieutenant when he said that I have but one annoyance with the administration of Chester Arthur, and that is that in contrast with it, the administration of Hayes becomes respectable, if not heroic. Well, this was damning indeed, because Roscoe Conklin and Rutherford Hayes had been at each other's throats his entire presidency. So this was certainly not a compliment. Well, Conklin actually was still in Arthur's mind because Arthur took a moment to nominate Roscoe Conklin for a position on the Supreme Court. Now, why did he do this? Maybe it was a reward for his old friend. Maybe it was to get Conklin out of the way, because if he's on the court, maybe he won't bother him anymore with pleas for patronage spots. But for whatever reason, he put forward the nomination, but Conklin turned it down. Basically told friends, I'm not taking the pay cut, I'm making too much money now that I'm a lawyer again, so he decided to pass. but he was also kind of a thing of the past. He was no longer really putting a lot of pressure on Arthur in terms of his own personal needs, but Arthur was being pushed beyond the personal. What about something in reform that was more permanent, a legislative solution? And for this, there was a sign that he was moving in this direction. For Chester Arthur's second annual message, December of 1882, his strongest advocacy to date for meaningful civil service reform. According to Arthur, he acknowledged an increase in the public interest in that subject. And the people of the country, apparently without distinction of party, have in various ways and upon frequent occasions given expression to their earnest wish for prompt and definite action. In my judgment, such action should no longer be postponed. Well, Congress was ready to take him up on this. Reformers had continued to come into Congress, and they were being led by Senator George Pendleton. Pendleton had introduced some serious civil service reform legislation the previous year. It didn't go anywhere. But now with the president kind of indicating some support, he came at it again. His legislation would require competitive examinations for at least 10% is a start, of federal positions. Under the authority of the president, though, he could expand that beyond the initial 10%. Promotions would be based by merit and competence. The financial assessments from the political machines would be strictly prohibited, and a civil service commission would be established for further rulemaking, to investigate abuses, supervise exams, and to report to Congress on an annual basis. Comprehensive legislation from George Pendleton. It passed both houses, and Chester Arthur gave it his signature. He signed into law the Pendleton Act January 16th of 1883. Now, the reformers were thrilled, but they were also cautious because they still needed to implement this law. The proof was going to be in the pudding, and for that they needed to rely on the president, Chester Arthur. He could either go full bore or he could try to stymie it. And the career spoilsman, much to the pleasure of the reformers, actually came through. That old Chester Arthur, the spoilsman, it seemed like he was a man of the past. He nominated 3 real reformers for the Civil Service Commission. He moved to expand the scope of the act beyond that initial 10%, and he did nothing to block the job of the commission in doing its function, which they acknowledged. The commissioners wrote, "Our functions cannot be successfully discharged without the constant, firm, and friendly support of the president." That support has never failed. The commission has never asked advice or an exercise of authority on the part of the president which has been refused. This was praise that was well earned for Chester Arthur. Now, in his view, his point of view, he gave his thoughts in his final message to Congress, in which Arthur said, "The system has fully answered the expectations of its friends in securing competent and faithful public service and in protecting the appointing officers of the government from the pressure of personal importunity and from the labor of examining the claims and pretenses of rival candidates for public employment." Chester Arthur had come full circle. The unlikeliest president in the history of the Republic, a product of machine politics where the goal was simply to win elections. It was all about power. You pass out jobs, you enforce those assessments, organize and discipline to win more elections. That had been the life of Chester Arthur, but no more. Chester Arthur, President of the United States, he repudiated his own past. The needs of the country trumped all. There was not much good that came out of the presidency of Chester Arthur, but he did do this. This was a real legacy, real reform in the civil service, led by the former spoilsman Chester Arthur. That is Chester Arthur. Shocker, from spoilsman to reform champion, from the life of Chester Arthur. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.